My name is Jill Dupre, and I'm the Associate Director of Atlas, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's Atlas Speaker Series event. The Speaker Series brings technologists, academics, practitioners, and innovative thinkers to campus as a way to start or further develop conversations that are at the intersection of technology and society. We hope you enjoy today's event and that you're able to join future Speaker Series events, including one next Monday, February 25th, when Dr. Renee Wittemeyer will speak about the internet gender gap in developing countries. And you can see the whole lineup and also some performances in this handout, which is right up here. The Speaker Series is possible because of a generous donation from Edith Harel-Caperton and Anat Harel. And today we are pleased to welcome Stormy Peters, who will share her perspective on and experiences with open source software. Stormy graduated from Rice University with a degree in computer science and is a longtime advocate of open source software and its potential to change the industry. Stormy is currently head of developer engagement at Mozilla and the founder of Kids on Computers, a nonprofit setting up computer labs in developing countries. She also co-founded and later served as executive director of the GNOME Foundation, a free software computing platform. Please join me in welcoming Stormy Peters.
So this morning I was watching this little blurb about how to give a presentation well, and it said one of the things the audiences do is sit there and wonder, why am I here? So I can't really tell you why you're here. But I can tell you why I'm here. I'm here because, to me, presentations are about learning things. They're about starting conversations. Hopefully you don't just sit here and listen and then go away and back to your real life. Hopefully you sit here and you have questions. We can have discussions. You can engage me on my blog or on Twitter later. You can go out to dinner with friends, tell your colleague this great idea that you were inspired by something else. So hopefully this is a conversation. So feel free to interrupt me at any time. Feel free to jump in with your own viewpoint on it. If I'm wrong or you think I'm wrong, correct me. We're a small enough group, we can have a good conversation. So I've been in open source software for more than 15 years, and it kind of makes me feel old, but my 6-year-old does an even better job of making me feel old. So yesterday he said, "Mom, did telephones really used to be attached to the wall?" And I said, "Yeah, they used to be attached to the wall, and you couldn't carry them around," and he just started laughing. And then he said, "Mom, were you around when they had the Wild West, the Old West?" I said, "No, I'm not that old." And he goes, "Well, I know you're not as old as the dinosaurs." So I'm old, but not too old. So in these 15 years in open source software, I think I'm seeing a trend, or at least I feel passionate about open source software that I think is changing the world. So this talk isn't going to tell you how to get rich. Isn't going to tell you how to predict the future by watching open source. But hopefully it will impassion you the next time you start something new to think about doing it in open source or doing it with an open community. One of these goes. And one of the prime examples I think of this was the One Laptop Per Child, the OLPC. I don't know how many of you are familiar with OLPC. Awesome. So back in, I think it was 2004 or 2005, Negroponte, the guy that started the initiative, said that he was going to make a laptop for $100 for kids in developing countries. And I don't know if you remember 2004, 2005, but a $100 laptop was not even fathomable. I mean, you paid much more for a laptop than a desktop, probably about $1,000. And this project was, so he said he was going to do $100 laptop, and he also, in the meantime, also innovated very much on how he made it. So, it's green, so it appeals to kids. It's got a keyboard you can spill things on. It's kid-sized. It's very friendly. But I really think that because they stood up and said they were going to make this for $100, which they never did, by the way. They still haven't. They generated a whole set of netbooks that later brought the price way down. So I bought this one for about $400 in 2007 or so. The idea was you bought one for $400, and they would send you one that was worth $200, and they would send one to a kid in a developing country. And then just a year or two later, I bought this for $400. And I used this as my main computer for several years whenever I was on the road. And so I think that by making that laptop, and I totally forgot about my slides, so by making that laptop, they totally started the whole netbook market. I mean, maybe the netbook market would have come around, but I don't think they would have felt the same pressure to do it for such a low cost as they would have if some nonprofit hadn't come out and said that they were going to make a $100 laptop. And so in a way, there was a nonprofit out there, the One Laptop Per Child, that drove an entire industry. And it's not been wildly successful. Like, you can't say that One Laptop Per Child has changed the world. But they did a number of things. They made a laptop that was much smaller, much cheaper. They even changed, because the power was less to keep the cost down, they even managed to change the power adapters. So you could argue that, you know, other laptops, even Apple now has cute little chargers that they didn't have before. I came over here to make a point about something. So they weren't wildly successful in the sense that they had a lot of supply problems in the beginning. So they had this dream, and they said they would make it. But they had, when I started Kids on Computers, I actually wanted to use OLPCs, and I couldn't get a hold of them in the numbers that I wanted. So we ended up going with recycled hardware. They also had the problem that they had a huge community. They had a huge opportunity. You would go to a conference. I went to Scale in California probably in 2007 or 8, and there were people walking around with these, and you could stop them and say, "Oh, is that an OLPC?" And they would say, "Yeah," and they would take it out, and they would sit there, and they would talk to you for half an hour, and show you all about it. And they were really excited, and they were really passionate about it. And at the end of the conversation, you would say, "So how are you related to OLPC? What do you do there?" And I'd say, "Oh, I don't work there. I just bought one." And they were going around the world pushing this cause and trying to help. And so I actually think OLPC didn't manage to take advantage of that community the way they could have if they wanted to, the way they could have. So when I look at, and I have more examples than just OLPC, but when I look at open source software or nonprofit projects that have really made a change in the way the industry works, that they have driven technology or changed the way that technology is made or used, there's probably a lot of factors, and I'm interested in hearing any that you guys have. But I think it's about dreaming big. I think it's much less scary for a nonprofit to say, "I'm going to make a $100 laptop," than for a large hardware vendor to say they're going to make a $100 laptop. They're not held to the same shareholder standards. They're allowed to be a little unrealistic because they're a nonprofit or they're open source, so they're allowed to make much bolder statements. And they are driven by idealistic views that are allowed to be much bigger. And then they're very good at building community. I mean, it was really easy to get behind the idea that we were going to bring $100 laptops to every kid in, all the countries in South America and Africa. I mean, that's something that a lot of people in my community were willing to pay $400 for this, even though it was just a kid's toy for us at the time. We were willing to pay $400 because it was going to change the world. So it builds that community of people willing to give time and effort and money to further the vision. And then it also provides building blocks. So the software that originally went into this is completely open source. Other people have taken that software and done other things with it. And I have a number of examples from the open source world, both software and hardware, where people have, by starting these projects, you provide building blocks to others that you may not even realize at the time. So dreaming big. So I think the open source world, I mean, probably the whole world always dreams big, but I think we saw some really amazing things happen in open source software. So for example, Linux was originally built, well, you could argue when it started, but Linus Torvalds in particular, who wrote the Linux kernel, he was a college student in Finland, right? Not Sweden, Finland. You guys got to keep me honest. He was a college student in Finland who said that he was going to build a Linux kernel as like his college project, and he did. And at the time, I worked at HP, and I had a team of 30 people just working on CDE, which was just the user interface for HPUX. So he said he could write one, and he went out and wrote one, and he wrote it in open source, and now there's actually thousands of people working on it. Probably at its core, it's 100 or so. But he dreamed big, and it didn't matter. He didn't have to convince his shareholders or his board or even really his friends that he could do it. He just got to go try it. The same way, so I work at Mozilla. We're a nonprofit, and our goal is to make sure that the internet is accessible to everybody. And we first came around when we made a browser. And in the goal of making the internet accessible to everybody, we realized that most people's first interaction with it at the time, now you could argue it's phones and we're working on a new project, but at the time, it was a browser on their desktop computer. And so we said we're going to go build an open source browser, and it's going to be open, it's going to put users in control, and it's going to push the envelope of technology. And we did it with a tremendous community. I wasn't actually part of the project when they did that, but Mozilla did that with a huge community of thousands of followers. Probably the core development team isn't thousands of people, but there's thousands of people that are willing to help. And at the time, they created a completely open source browser that pushed the limits. Like you can thank the open source project Firefox for like tabbed browsing on your browser. So it not only created an open source alternative that put the user in control, but pushed the limits of technology. So I didn't start out. I'm curious what your guys' background's like. How many people here are students? Cool. And how many people are in the industry in the area? And teaching or working here? Cool. And how many people have worked on an open source project? Okay. And how many people agree with my initial premise that open source pushes the boundaries of technology? How many people say, well, it doesn't? Or don't have an opinion? You have to tell me why. You can listen to my argument, or you can pipe it at any time. Other ways that the dreaming big, I mean, if you look at Apache, it's used, whether they were dreaming big or they just ended up big, it's now used by just about every web server out there. So it's an open source project. It's very much in hands of the community, even though it was funded in large part by IBM and other large companies. It's a project that is run and controlled by a community of contributors. It has its own organization, it has its own board of directors, it has its own annual conference every year. And they got there because somebody said we need a better web server and I'm willing to do it in the open. You know, it's the ability to think that it doesn't take a lot of people to do something, which gets to the building community. I think if you look at a lot of the really successful open source software projects that have made an impact in the world, like One Laptop Per Child, like Linux, like many others, they really built a community. So they managed to find people that cared and work with them. How many people here have read the Spider versus the Starfish, or Starfish versus the Spider, the book? So there's a book, I think it's the Starfish versus the Spider. If no one's read it, no one can correct me. And it's about how large companies are traditionally spider organized. So large companies have a CEO or a board of directors that then vets every idea and makes all the decisions. And so all the decisions have to bubble back up to the head of the spider, and then it sends them back down into the arms. Typically, open source software organizations or community-driven organizations are starfish. And so if you cut off the arm of a starfish, the original starfish grows another one, and the arm that you cut off can also grow into a new starfish. And so decisions aren't made so much by one group that knows everything. Rather, decisions are made by each project and each individual. And I think that's a real strength when it comes to changing technology. Because if I'm going to work on this project, and I think it really needs a better alphabet game or a better phonics game, because otherwise these kids aren't going to learn. And I think the phonics game has to be in the following 20 languages, or it's just not going to work. I don't have to go back and convince Negroponte, the guy that's making it, that this phonics game is a good idea. I can just go out and maybe I go to my blog, maybe I go to my friends, maybe I know a teacher, convince my kid's teacher, and we can just write it. And our own little group might vet what's a good idea and what's not a good idea. But we don't have to go back and convince a central group that everything we want to do is a good idea. It also means the central group doesn't get to control what everybody does. So they no longer have that command and control. They can't put 1,000 people on this project because it's the next new thing. Keep going the wrong way. And what's important about this community is it's not just a community of fans. So like if you look at Apple's community is very much a community of fans. They're people that are very proud of their Apple products. They like them, they love them. In the beginning, they did really awesome outreach. Like I heard that the headphones that went to the iPod, they're white and people would wear them, and people would, it's kind of like advertising the Apple product. They were the first ones that made white headphones. So if someone was wearing a white headphones, you knew they had an Apple iPod. But in the end, their community is a community of fans, a community of people willing to use their products, promote their products, but they can't really help out. Where if you look at OLPC, people could dig into the project. All the information about how it was run was on the wiki, so they could read about it. They could know what countries they were going to. The same with and it's hard for large companies. The larger the organization grows, the harder it is, because now you're a starfish and there's not one person who knows the answer. So sometimes finding information is a bit difficult. But if you look at Mozilla right now, we're working on making a Firefox OS phone. And the idea is to bring a phone built entirely on HTML5, so entirely open source, open standards phone based on web technologies. And they'll easily be able to run any application or website out there on your phone. And to bring it, low cost isn't necessarily the goal, but to bring it at a very reasonable cost, starting in countries like Brazil, which aren't the, so starting in developing countries are developing economies. And anyone can pitch it. So we have a community in Brazil that is helping us develop apps, that is going out and building events, that is really excited about this phone that's coming to their market. And it's worldwide. It was really exciting. We had more than 20 events all on the same day. And we had them from Brazil to, it was Kenya, all sorts of countries in Europe. I was in the one in Spain. It was in the UK. We had people in Japan and Taiwan, all on the same day having a big hack fest where people who just wanted to come see if they could make an HTML5 app for a phone showed up and spent their Saturday with us. And we learned from the events were run by volunteers, volunteers attended, they wrote apps. I learned that parking must be a huge problem in Madrid because I was in Madrid and there was like 3 parking apps written that day about how to remember where your car was. So people wrote what was interesting to them and relevant to their market. And that community is really important, I think, to driving change in the world. And they're believers. I mean, they're not just giving up their Saturday, but they're trying to make the world a different and better place. They want to help kids out in developing countries because they know it'll make the whole world better for all of us. I'm kind of repeating myself, huh? The next piece I wanted to talk about is building blocks, and I think it's been one of the reasons that people say open source software is successful because it's each that you can build on each other. And I was having this debate about standards at Mozilla just a couple days ago. So one of the ideas is that one of the things that frustrated me when I was at HP and I had 30 people working on CDE was that I would go to these standards meetings and these other companies had exactly the same number of people working on the exact same software that did the exact same thing. I mean, maybe theirs had different bugs, but it was all essentially the same piece of software. And to be honest, that frustrated me since I was in college, and professors would give the same assignment to everybody in the class. So I don't know how many assemblers have been written in the world, but a lot of them by students. And so we were duplicating the effort. So to me, open source software was really exciting because if I wrote the user interface for Linux, you could also use it. And if you fixed a bug, it fixed my bug, and then you could take it and use it. And what that meant was that all of us could use our extra brain power to go and build something else. So building blocks was kind of one of the big draws of open source software to me. And I think it's one of the ways, I think especially now for some reason, it's going beyond software. It's going into the hardware and small business space, and it's really enabling people to have an idea and to very quickly implement it and then take it to market. And so I can't say I'm wealthy rich, that I've made lots of money predicting the stock market, but I think there's going to be a lot of products that come out soon that are based on this idea of hardware that's very easy to assemble for anyone around the world. So Arduino was one of the first projects that came out in this sense, and it was basically an open source hardware building block. It's like a, I don't have another picture, but it's basically, it was a piece of hardware, and you could put a Linux operating system on it, and you could make it do things. So I first ran into it at a workshop in Australia, Linux Conf Australia. And I went to a half-day workshop. I don't write a lot of code anymore, so I thought maybe this is going to be over my head. It was fascinating. This guy took an Arduino board. This is a picture of part of one. And he took this Arduino board, and he took a fan, and he plugged them into his computer in the front of the room. He plugged the fan into the wall, and he plugged the Arduino board into the fan into his computer. And by the end of the day, we could all log into Second Life and turn that fan on and off at the front of the room. And so that meant that, so what he had done with this, and he shared pictures and stories, is he had actually done things like his sprinkler system was completely controlled from his computer. And he'd done this himself. And so he could turn his sprinklers on and off. He could raise his garage door up and down. He could open and close the shades in his baby's bedroom, depending on whether he wanted her to keep sleeping or wake up. And the funniest one to me is he'd actually made a little app that when the postman opened his physical mailbox, you couldn't tell whether someone put something in or not, but if he opened it and closed it, it sent him an email saying that he had mail. So, and maybe none of those applications are extremely useful, and maybe, like some of them have been way overdone a million times, but the thought that anyone for a couple $100 could buy a piece of hardware and with enough skills to write some code, could take that hardware, marry it to some code, and design a whole new product. And not one that they had to send off to China to get fabricated, not one that they needed a team of 10 engineers to write code for, but that all the building blocks were there for them to develop it is really amazing and world-changing to me. So the new one that's come out, and it sounds very similar, but it's got a couple of key differences. And it's called Raspberry Pi, and this picture actually has a case that somebody built for it. So the board actually fits in the palm of your hand very easily. And it's also an entire computer, fits in the palm of your hand, can plug into a keyboard and a TV. So now you have a computer. Oh, and it costs $35. So for $35, you have a computer. So imagine what this means to kids in developing countries who may have a TV in their home, who can probably find a $20 keyboard cheaper than they can find other things. Or maybe this thing doesn't have a keyboard. I don't know about you guys. My kids don't want to use a computer anymore. They just want a phone or a tablet. They think they keep hitting the screen of my monitor, and it's all fingerprinted. If I were going to predict something, I would say that touch computing is going to replace desktops for most use cases. Not the entire world, probably not people that write code or do lots of intensive, I don't know. I think there's going to be a better input method here soon. There's got to be. So you could imagine this device for $35 can input into a variety of different scenarios, and with a little bit of software can do different things. I didn't download the video. I probably should have. There's a video of a guy who took this and actually made a machine that will give his dog a treat. He has a webcam in his house, and then this Raspberry Pi is connected to a machine that dispenses treats to the dog when he does something on his laptop. So he can give treats to his dog remotely. There are people that have used it to make lots of different drum sets from different things, and then it's connected. It's really quite innovative, the different ways that people use it. And I have a friend that bought one, and he said, I've made it into a media center for my house. It's like my Apple TV. It doesn't do anything more. And I'm like, but all these other use cases that you could do with this. You can copy that first use case. Maybe you like the dog treat thing, or you like the garage door opener, or the sprinkler thing, or the music thing, and then you can take it and you can play with it. And you can take if they open source their code, you can take their code and use it. So in this case, Raspberry Pi runs Android, it runs Linux, runs Firefox OS. Firefox OS wasn't even at version 1, hadn't been released. That's what the operating system we're putting on the phone. And someone ported it to Raspberry Pi. There's a number of people that are using it to do different gaming controls for different devices. So playing with it and how it can be like an Xbox controller. Has anybody heard of like a really cool story about how? Yeah.
Yeah, I saw someone actually take a Raspberry Pi and turn it into a gaming coffee table. So they built the coffee table itself, but then hooked it up to the Raspberry Pi and it became this
$35 and your imagination and the software to make it work. The other kind of playing on this hardware and Raspberry Pi thing, I think, is 3D printers. So I actually read an article that was only half joking the other day. I mean, they're working on it. They're working on making it so you can print food these days. This was the closest picture I could get of it. But they're actually thinking it has an application in space. Pretty soon you'll be able to print food. So the astronaut will be able to say what they want. It'll have some kind of nutritious substance in the printer, and it'll print it out. Now they're still working on textures and flavors and interesting things like that, but it's the idea that you can take any material you have and dispense it in any kind of shape that you can make. And people are open sourcing the designs that they're using to print these things. So for example, I bought a keyboard for my boyfriend for his tablet, and I needed something to hold both the things up together, you know, the tablet with the keyboard. And one of my friends was like, oh, I designed one of those. If you have access to a 3D printer, here's the design. And so I could print out my own little holder for my tablet that I didn't design, I didn't have to buy, that somebody else had the same problem and invented it and put it out there for anybody to use. And so all I have to do is have access to a 3D printer, which is a little more difficult, and the materials to print it out with. But it's being used in some really crazy, awesome ways. So there was a guy in Los Angeles who was working on, I think his original design, I should have printed these, my 6-year-old was laughing at the videos, but he created like extensions for his hands. It looked like a claw, you know, from a science fiction movie, and he printed that out. And he was contacted by somebody in South Africa whose kid is missing his fingers. And between the two of them, the one guy in Los Angeles and the other guy in South Africa, and they're both engineers and, you know, both very savvy about this stuff, but they managed to print this little kid a hand. So on a 3D printer, they printed him a hand that he can now move and he can grasp things. And there's like a video of him grasping coins and moving them, and then he's throwing a ball. But what's really amazing about that is there was no medical company involved, there was no insurance involved, there was no patents involved. It was just a couple of guys who had something they needed to get done, and somebody else saw another application for it, and they worked together and made a community. And the hand design is open source. I don't know if it's an open source license, but anyone can download it and print one as well. So I mentioned this one a couple of times. I really think that computing is changing from the keyboard to the monitor. Those of us that can type faster than we can talk are not quite as sold on it yet. But it's moving to more people in the developing world are obviously coming into touch with technology through their phones than computers. And phones now do way more than the first computer I ever got. So the way I think for most of the world to interface with technology is going to be through phones. So Mozilla is working on Firefox OS, which is an open source, open standards, HTML5 operating system for phones, with the idea that we'll bring the internet to a lot more people that way. So those are the three main points that I wanted to make, and I wanted to make this a discussion now. I didn't say that the title of my talk is that open source drives technology. To me, I didn't mean any particular open source license. So I didn't mean like GPL licensed software or Apache licensed software. I think the license is much less important than that thought of dreaming big, having that really big vision for what you could do, and then implementing it in a way that community can participate. Whether that means that you put an open source license on your software so that others feel free to grab it and modify it, or whether it just means you put the design for your hand that you've printed on the internet and just let people copy it. To me, the open source is that the building community part is important. It also comes with a lot of other pieces, which I'm happy to talk about, like the having a distributed command and control, the starfish model as opposed to the spider. There's a lot of pieces that make community possible in open source worlds. And then it's providing those building blocks that others can use and envision and dream bigger than you would ever think of. I think the person that develops the technology usually doesn't really know all the places it will go. And so if you limit yourself to yourself or to your 10 employees in your company, you're really limiting where that technology can go.